Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Setting Your Site Up for Success, whether you are new to research or experienced. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Elligo Health Research, who developed the content for this presentation. Elligo Health Research accelerates clinical trials through healthcare with access to over 150 million known patients and their HIPAA-compliant healthcare data, as well as the Elligo Research Stack technology and patient select identification and engagement model. This, coupled with the largest known patient access network, Elligo's site solutions enable healthcare practices and research sites to participate in clinical trials. By adaptive engagement of known patients and physicians, they accelerate the development of new pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device and diagnostic products. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Riley Kammer is the Vice President of Network Expansion at Elligo Health Research. He focuses on expanding and diversifying Elligo's robust network of research partner sites, practices, and health systems. As Director of Sponsor and CRO Alliances, he oversaw trial acquisition and placement by leading efforts to strengthen existing and develop new strategic partnerships with major pharma, biotech, and CROs. He started his career in finance, working in a variety of capacities at a healthcare-focused investment bank. And Dawn Sauro has 30+ years of drug and device development experience, including working for sites, sponsors, and CROs. She has experience across a broad spectrum of therapeutic areas, but her main area of focus and expertise is in hematology and oncology, having led several successful hematology-oncology development programs from first-in-human through successful registration. She brings this expertise in delivery to help sponsors drive results. But now, without further ado, let's go ahead and hand things over to our first speaker today. Riley Kammer, you may begin when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And just to confirm, you can see my screen. So everyone who's attended, thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to speak with you. And again, our webinar will be on setting your site up for success, whether you're new to research or experienced. So just to begin, and Ryan given a bit of an overview, but some background on Elligo Health Research is that we are a healthcare enabling research organization, and our mission and our ultimate goal is to expand access to research, right? So we do this in a number of different ways, but most importantly, we focus on maintaining the integrity of the trusted physician-patient relationship, healthcare communities, and then leverage things such as EHR data in order to bring clinical research as a care option to more patients. We collectively have experience across all clinical trial phases in a wide variety of therapeutic areas and specialties, which you can see listed. So without kind of further ado, I will kind of move forward and address what we'll be covering in this webinar, and we're excited to speak with you today about. So the first thing would be kind of really laying just the foundation for the topics in and of themselves by hitting on common challenges for clinical research sites before diving into an overview of the clinical research landscape, focusing on both therapeutic area trial trends as well as trial models, and then ultimately diving into what we hope will be successful takeaways for all of those that are attending, best practices for site success. So I will go ahead and kick things off with common challenges for clinical research sites. So again, I do want to note that whether you are new to research or you've conducted thousands of studies, these are challenges that you either have or likely will encounter throughout your research journey. So to name a few, ebbs and flows of trial volume within a site's core therapeutic area or areas, right? And we'll get into essentially why that poses a challenge for sites later on in the presentation. Second challenge would be the tightening of study populations and protocols into themselves, something that we'll dive into detail on. And then lastly, we want to hit on the fact that there are multiple trial models that are commonly being used for industry-sponsored trials. Again, just a little teaser of what we'll be covering and speaking to today. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Dawn to start our discussion on the overall clinical research landscape, focusing on trial trends, therapeutic areas, study populations, and protocol complexity.
Great, thank you, Riley. Next slide. So as we think about managing the volume by a therapeutic area, I'm sure you've all seen that there are natural ebbs and flows in the number of studies being conducted with any therapeutic area. There's sometimes a high degree of interest or some sort of prevalence or public awareness of a disease like COVID, or sometimes things will wane due to maybe an approval where there's a newly approved product that's out there that everybody is starting to take. So it's important to manage in your practice and your research practice how you can keep that even revenue stream and keep the number of trials constant so that you're busy all the time. So the decrease in number of trials at a site-specific area of focus have far-reaching impacts, the decrease of revenue, and it's important for you to understand trends and maybe broaden your ability to conduct different types of trials so that you can keep the peaks off of the hills. So next slide. So if we look at the industry data, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody that oncology is the biggest therapeutic area. And this data is from 2017 to 2022, so it's also not surprising that there is a big chunk of it that sits in infectious disease, which probably would have been smaller had we not just recently gone through that pandemic. Oncology probably would account for more like 40% of the work. And then there's a lot of other things where the neurology is big, and we've been seeing a lot of other things that are gaining. So that's captured on the next slide. So this is the top therapeutic area by the studies that we've seen at Elligo. So we have seen a lot of oncology and hematology studies, and then neurology, and then there's that infectious disease. We don't have as big of an oncology presence right now. We're growing that, so that's why we probably have not seen as many as the natural curve is. But as you can see, across our entire site network, it's very diverse, and it is good because it helps balance out the workload at our sites. We're continuing to trend back towards that more pre-pandemic situation where we probably will see less infectious disease going forward and less vaccine trials. Next slide. And then these are the indications. So, not surprisingly, if you take the oncology pieces, you look at the solid tumors, the colorectal cancer, the breast cancer, and you put them together, and that gives the oncology thing. The COVID percentage is almost the entire what you have seen, what we saw but for infectious disease. What we have seen recently is a lot of atopic dermatitis and type 2 diabetes studies, as well as obesity studies. And some of the type 2 diabetes also have an obesity cohort. So a lot of those go hand in hand. And those are good studies that a lot of general practices can fulfill and are also typically quick to enroll. Next slide. So what's one of the challenges is that more and more of the trials are getting more narrowly focused in the patient population. So, in oncology, we see a lot of particular mutations that we're seeing. So it's no longer just the AML studies, which are hard enough to recruit on their own, but now we're looking for specific mutations. Then looking for different age groups. You see this a lot in the vaccine trials where, they'll be targeting an older or younger population. There's the resistant diseases and uncontrolled diseases, and then not just fatty liver disease, but there's the, people are looking for NASH patients, and those are even harder to find, and there's a lot of competition in that space. So there's more and more trials, but it's harder and harder to recruit. So thinking about the standard of care that's out there and the need for better diversity, you really have to understand the diseases, your patient population, and then how you're going to make sure that you're taking the right trials and investing your time in things that you can be successful at. Next slide. So the complexity of the trials doesn't end with the inclusion-exclusion criteria. There's technology, more and more technology coming at our sites, multiple vendors involved in IVR, e-diaries, EDC. You know, if you go to a site today, you'll see tons of different laptops and tablets and everything, and that complicates things. It's a training challenge. If there's staff turnover, then there's more training involved. So, you know, the next kind of column is staff and thinking about that. While technology is there to sometimes make our lives easier, it has made it a bit more complex, and having the right staff around to do those parts of it, as well as the clinical staff to treat the patients. So we're seeing that it requires more staff for each study in the same population. And then the study design, you know, we see sometimes sponsors aren't really thinking about how trials are playing out in the clinic, particularly for, you know, the community-based practices. You know, procedures like 12 and 24-hour PKs are becoming more common, longer days where you have to think about overtime and, again, more staff to accommodate the procedures that are required for the protocol. Gone are the days of the easy studies where everything can be done between a 9 and 5 day and, you know, very simply completed. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Riley.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I think that was a great overview of things. Kind of moving on and setting the laying the groundwork for what we're seeing in the current research landscape. I think study trends and more specifically trial models themselves are worth mentioning, because as I had alluded to at the beginning of this webinar, it's increasingly common that we're seeing multiple different trial models being employed across industry-sponsored trials. And when I say industry-sponsored trials, I mean you have a pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device, so on and so forth company that is sponsoring the trial. So with that being said, let's start with an overview of the trial models in and of themselves. And it's, again, worth noting that over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen an increase in the number of trial models that are not just being used every once in a while, but are being actively used for industry-sponsored trials. So at a high level, traditional trials are clinical trials that are conducted in person, right? Patients come to the research site for study visits. They're interacting face-to-face with the investigator and other study staff. And then the other bucket of trials we're seeing are decentralized trials. So why I say bucket is because decentralized trials, or DCTs, are a very broad term, right? So essentially, they can be a hybrid. They can either be a hybrid study, which we'll get into what that means, or a completely virtual trial, which we'll also explore in a little bit more detail. But again, broadly speaking, DCTs are executed through telemedicine and or mobile health providers using processes and technologies that differ from traditional clinical trial model. So as you can see, an extremely, extremely broad definition. That's why we felt it would be a good idea to go into a little bit more detail about the main two that we see. So the first being hybrid models, right? So hybrid study models really mean that some study activities are being conducted remotely using technologies, while others may take place in person, just as they would during a traditional study. Siteless or virtual trials are exactly what they sound like, right? There's no traditional sites, so physical locations. There's no in-person interaction with patients going on site. And study activities are largely and generally solely conducted through technology or home health visits. But again, that's just to provide an overview before we deep dive into some more information, talk about the advantages and limitations of these models. So again, worth noting that the reason that they're called traditional or a traditional model trial is because up until about 10 or so years ago, these were the only types of industry-sponsored studies, or the only model being employed on industry-sponsored studies. So traditional trials are always going to include trials that are conducted in person, right? Patients are coming to the research site for their study visits. They're having that face-to-face interaction with not only the investigator, but also the other study staff that is on site. So naturally, some advantages come by this model, right? So patients can participate in clinical trials with a physician that they know and trust, right? This may be anything from their primary care physician to a specialist that they see on a regular basis. And it does allow for increased oversight of all study activities by the investigator and site staff compared to a virtual or hybrid trial in some cases. So it wouldn't be fair to speak to the advantages of a particular trial model without speaking to some of the limitations, right? And kind of why we're seeing an evolution. So some of the limitations are a little bit obvious, right? There's patient burden involved in traveling to and from the study site for said trial visits, especially in scenarios where the trial site may be, let's say, not within easy driving distance, right, of their house. And then patient health information being predominantly conducted on site during study visits, as opposed to, you know, at home visits or at telehealth check-ins on a more frequent basis. So juxtaposing to the traditional trials, did want to cover DCTs broadly, but also speak about siteless and virtual, and then the actual hybrid trials in a little bit more detail. So for a siteless trial, again, there's no traditional sites, physical locations, as the name would imply, meaning that there is no in-person interaction between the patients and what would traditionally be site staff, right? The study visits and study activities are conducted using technologies or through a home health visit. So an example of a home health visit may be a, travel nurse that's coming and doing a blood draw. You can also have a phlebotomist doing that, but certain vitals, measurements, so on and so forth, being taken either, again, in the comfort of the patient's own home or via, let's say a FaceTime telehealth type setup. So there are some advantages to this model as well as some limitations. Some of the advantages include that it can be more convenient for patients to participate in this type of model, right? They don't have to leave the comfort of their own home, don't have to deal with traveling back and forth, which can lead to having a larger and more diverse patient population participation in said study. And then a lot of the times, depending upon the technologies being used, such as wearables, it does give the ability to monitor a patient's health more or less on a real-time basis, right? That you wouldn't necessarily have if you were going in clinic, right? You have a visit, 2 weeks later, you come in for your second visit, so on and so forth. But that being said, there are some very real limitations to this model. And obviously that has implications as to what types of studies, and I should say that based upon protocol design, so on and so forth, can be conducted in a fully siteless or virtual model. So as a little bit more granular of an example to the limitations, virtual trials may not be suitable for many interventional studies, right? So if you think about different ways that investigational products are administered, so if an investigational product is administered via, let's say, an ultrasound guided intra-articular injection, or an infusion, those are typically things that you cannot do in either a home health visit or virtually, right? Especially anything that involves surgical procedures and or more invasive procedures. And they're also generally not suitable for more severe disease states where patients require a higher level of care that often is facilitated, right, through that in-person physician to patient interaction. So now moving on to hybrid trials in and of themselves. So the best way to think about hybrid trials is it blends some elements of a virtual trial with some elements of a traditional trial, right? So what that means is that some study activities are conducted remotely using technologies or home health, while others take place in person at traditional study sites, right? Just as a traditional model trial would. So some of the advantages of this are it does ease the burden that patients face in participating, right? So if you have a study with 10 visits, 5 of them are going to take place on site, 5 of them are going to take place either virtually or via home health visit. That obviously makes it a little bit easier on that patient in and of themselves to participate because you've essentially reduced the amount of travel that they'll have to do by 50%. And then at the same time, one of the big pros behind the traditional model that you'll also see carried into the hybrid is that face-to-face interaction, right? That patients are having with their trusted physicians as well as other site staff. And then limitations, very similar to virtual trials. If you have a study where there are invasive study procedures being performed, you obviously could not do those during a home health or telehealth type of visit. But hopefully this has been a good high-level overview of what Dawn covered for the clinical current research landscape, right? So the therapeutic area, as well as indication trends that we're seeing both in industry as well as here as Elligo, kind of some of the implications they are, and then having covered, again, the common trial model types that are now being conducted in industry-sponsored studies. So with that said, we kind of wanted to flip things to best practices for site success, so that we can kind of have some key takeaways for all of the audience that have joined today. So the best place to start when we're talking about site success, and this really draws back to what Dawn had mentioned when we're talking about ebbs and flows of trials within a site's primary therapeutic areas or therapeutic area. So what does portfolio expansion mean? Portfolio expansion really means the ability to break into a new indication or new therapeutic area, right? And this is extremely important, as Dawn mentioned, due to the fact that the more areas that you're able to conduct research in, the better protected you are from a slowdown in the number of trials from a revenue standpoint in any given area. And being able to conduct studies across a variety of therapeutic areas can often lead to enhanced sponsor and CRO relationships. An increasing number of sponsors and CROs, what we're seeing on a real-time basis is that they're interested in partnering with sites that can contribute to studies across multiple areas. And then what you get out of that as a benefit, right, as a site from partnering with a sponsor or CRO are efficiencies, right? Sometimes you get early access to studies. Sometimes you get dedicated points of contact within that organization that help you escalate things as needed. And then oftentimes you'll have master agreements to make the negotiation of each individual study budget and clinical trial agreement that much easier and more efficient for your site. So a question that we often get asked by sites that are considering breaking into a new therapeutic area is, how do I choose the therapeutic area that is best for me? So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer, because each individual site's setup, right, resources, so on and so forth are going to be different, but there are a handful of common considerations that we would recommend that you look into, right? So if you're considering between two different therapeutic areas, look into what the projected trial volume is going to be. So a good way to benchmark that, aside from any sort of industry statistics you can get, is thinking about the factors that are incentivizing research and development spending in that area. This is something that Dawn had alluded to, right? It could be an increase in the prevalence of a particular disease or disease state. It could be an increase in just the public awareness, right? Which we've seen with a number of things like COVID, obesity over the last 20 years, and even indications such as NASH. Another area that you should really look at when making a determination is, what are your current sponsor relationships, right? How many of those are working in overlapping areas of what you're considering breaking into, right? There's efficiency there. If you've worked with a sponsor before and are able to contribute to them in other projects in a different therapeutic area, you start working towards that partnership relationship. And then I think last and equally importantly, operational considerations, right? So is my site really situated to conduct research in this new area? So broadly, when we're talking about operational considerations, you can boil them down to a few key points. Investigators, right? Do I need to bring on a specialist to successfully conduct a study in a new area? Study procedures, right? Are we set up to accommodate specialized procedures, or would I need to go partner with a new facility to do so, such as imaging, so on, an imaging facility, so on and so forth. And then scales and assessments. When we're talking about data collection that obviously goes towards the endpoint of clinical trials, scales and assessments are going to be key. So does my current staff have experience with the common scales and assessments that are associated with our target therapeutic area or indication. And this is very high level. So what we wanted to do is give 2 examples for different therapeutic areas, and I'll turn it over to Dawn to cover oncology.
Great, thanks, Riley. I mentioned earlier that oncology is a big area, and most of the time for interventional trials, it's an oncologist who is the PI or the sub-investigator. There are instances where perhaps an example would be prostate cancer, where it's treated at urologists, where maybe they can get involved and broaden what they're doing from a research perspective. But most of the interventional treatment studies are at specialty clinics. But there are other specialties that can get involved. There are a lot of these early cancer detection studies that are out there, diagnostics, colon cancer screening types of trials. So there's a lot of other things that could happen where the patients are being worked up and before they're diagnosed, but maybe are having some procedures done that are leading towards a diagnosis. They're looking for the enriched patients, but they're also, many of these studies are looking for healthy normal controls, which are really good studies. They're usually a quick blood sample, and they're a good kind of gap filler for down periods of time to pick up these studies that are just very simple, and that you might have patients and you might get introduced to an oncologist that perhaps you can partner with on something like maybe a supportive care study. There are a lot of special nuances and procedures involved in oncology interventional trials. Usually you have to have some infusion capabilities, and that's where a lot of the PK assessments come in. So again, that could be an instance where perhaps there's a trial that's suited for you to find the patients, but maybe you partner with an oncologist that can provide some of the support that you might need from a facility standpoint. There's the scales and assessments that are used for either inclusion criteria such as ECOG or endpoints, RECIST, and it's important to understand those if you're going to take the PI responsibilities on. But a lot of the times the specialty clinics can be the feeders, or they can also be supportive in the trials, and it's a good way for your practice to get involved in oncology trials. Riley?
Thanks, Dawn. And then flipping things from oncology to neurology and focusing on some of the key overall areas that Dawn had mentioned. So when we think about neurology trials, right, oftentimes neurological conditions are not just chronic, they're progressive, right? So based upon those disease states, and speaking in generalities, you'll want to have a neurologist that can at least serve as a sub-I, right? And hopefully that neurologist would have an active practice, right, where they're seeing a wide variety of different patients with different neurological conditions. Or failing having an active practice, your site, your clinic has a strong and trusted referral network, right, for patient referrals for these trials. But again, typically we see, especially in the more severe disease states within neurology, that sponsors would want a neurologist to serve at minimum as a sub-I, right? And then similar to what Dawn discussed on the oncology side with scales and assessments, some of the common ones that you'll see, especially in indications such as Alzheimer's disease, would be your ADAS-Cog, MMSE, and MPI. So neurology studies in general tend to have a lot of imaging that is involved in them. That could be MRIs, that could be PET scans, it could be CT scans, it could be even more specialized imaging than that. So making sure that if you don't have these capabilities on site, right, which many people don't, you're partnered with an imaging center, right, that does have these capabilities, typically through some sort of vendor agreement. And another example of study procedures that you would want to have the ability to conduct would be lumbar punctures, right? So that's not just the ability to conduct the puncture itself, but you need to be able to articulate the ability or the importance of it as a study procedure to patients, right? Because understandably, if someone is going to get a lumbar puncture, they want to know, why is this important for the study? But again, these are just a few of when we talked about the operational considerations, staff, procedures, equipment, so on and so forth, that you would want to think about when deciding, hey, how am I going to expand? And obviously we couldn't, based upon what webinar link, sit here and give an example for every single therapeutic area, but if you have any interest in one that we haven't discussed, please feel free to ping us, email us after the presentation, and we can definitely provide some specifics for you. So that being said, moving on to our next topic, right, for setting yourself up for success, feasibility questionnaires. So those of you that have experience conducting research, even if you've just done a few studies at this point, are well aware of feasibility questionnaires and the role that they play in your site's ability to be awarded and ultimately conduct a trial. So to start things off with, right, what is a feasibility questionnaire, right? And what is the purpose? And you'll see that in this middle block on the screen. But if you think about it from a site's perspective, an FQ, a feasibility questionnaire, provides site the opportunity to showcase fit for selection for a study, right? It's really a site's application for, hey, we're very interested in this study and we think that we could be a top contributor from an enrollment standpoint. Conversely, study teams, so typically the sponsor or their CRO, are using feasibility questionnaires to gauge potential sites' suitability for a trial. So with that background, the site selection process. So that's what we refer to as the process where, hey, if a study is ultimately going to need 100 sites, they begin approaching, well, it's typically 250 to 300 to ultimately select that 100 that will be conducting the study. So as you can see, this is a very, very competitive process. And feasibility tends to be the step where the largest number of sites are removed from consideration, largely based upon, the sponsor CRO's review of the feasibility questionnaire in and of itself. So good feasibility, quote unquote, good feasibility responses greatly enhance your chance as a site for landing that study that you're really interested in. Bad feasibility responses may completely eliminate your chances. So again, this may be rudimentary for some of you that are on the webinar, but I do think it's worth hitting on because this is really the key inflection point. Typically what you'll see is, let's say that 250 of these 300 sites submit a feasibility questionnaire and the study only needs 100 sites. Generally, somewhere between 105 and 110 will be chosen based upon their feasibility responses to progress to the next step, right? So you can see how, which is typically a PSV or a pre-study visit, but you can see how this single step in the site identification, site selection process is so crucial as a site for putting your best foot forward and ultimately having the best chance of landing that study that's in a high interest area. So in giving that background, I wanted to talk about best practices for feasibility questionnaire completion. So in doing what we do, we see a lot of feasibility questionnaires, and it's kind of easy to pinpoint a few high-level mistakes that are commonly made, right? So leaving a question blank. That in and of itself may not sound like a big deal, right? You're dealing with a 50-question questionnaire. Why does it matter if one of those questions are left blank? The same goes to not providing enough detail. The reason that matters, right, is you have to think about this. Oftentimes, the information being put down on that feasibility questionnaire is the only information that a sponsor or their CRO has about your facility, right? And again, why are you the right site to conduct this study? So leaving questions blank, not providing enough detail, sometimes you'll see that there's a mindset of, hey, if this site could not bother to fill out a feasibility questionnaire fully and correctly, what sort of attention are they going to be putting into the study? I'm not saying that's not a right or wrong mindset to have, but I am saying that I've seen that line of thinking happen a number of times, right? So just the basics of making sure not only have you filled in all questions, but you're providing enough detail, right, to sufficiently answer the question. So you'll see the third bullet point down, right, is this being too conservative with key feasibility numbers. So I want to be careful about how to phrase this because you need to put down realistic numbers. But when I say being too conservative, what I really mean is oftentimes I will see a site put down, say, hey, we have X number of patients in our database that is our, total patient access. That's almost always asked on a feasibility questionnaire. How many patients do you have access to with a specific condition? How many of those meet the inclusion/exclusion criteria? How many could you enroll either on a monthly basis or in a 12-month period, right? So when you start that top number, the how many patients do I have access to, and you're only relying on your research database, you're short selling yourself, right? Depending upon your setup, you should also consider the investigator's practice, right? If that's relevant. You should consider your referral sources as well, which are obviously going to increase this number versus just database alone. So ultimately, the key takeaway that I want everyone to have here is make sure that you're considering, when answering patient access and enrollment questions, all sources of patient access that you have, not just your research database alone, right? So again, could be your investigator's practice or other physicians you have on staff's practices that could contribute patients, or other key referral sources that you have a long-standing relationship with. And then failing to highlight key selling points. I mean, this is especially something that I would say is highly important when you're applying for your first study in a new indication or therapeutic area, right? Because you don't have that, you don't have the ability to draw and say, hey, we've conducted, 10 other studies in this specific patient population. So including information about why your site, right, is going to be a good fit is really important. That could be patient access, that could be clinical experience, it could be a number of different things. And oftentimes, you will want to use the comment section. Typically, this is like the last portion of the FQ, and it'll say something like, please include any other relevant information that you are not able to include elsewhere in this document, or something to that effect, right? So this is also probably, in my experience, the most commonly skipped over or left blank section, and I feel that that is a big mistake to make. The reason being is it provides another opportunity to demonstrate why your site should be selected for the study. So utilize this comment section to reemphasize your site's interest in the particular protocol, the study that you're applying for, and include selling points of why you're a good fit that either could not be highlighted elsewhere in the FQ, or you want to reiterate based upon their importance, the study conduct. An example may be utilizing the comment section effectively, may be hey, we are extremely interested in the study, and we feel that we are well positioned to be a heavy contributor from an enrollment standpoint. Our physician has 20 plus years of clinical expertise, treats these patients on a daily basis within their practice, and then based upon our site and our site staff overall clinical trial expertise, maybe even throw in numbers, 200 studies throughout the last 10 years, we feel well positioned again to be a top contributor and look forward to hearing on next steps. So feasibility questionnaire, I know it's a small portion of when we're thinking about the whole end-to-end from, hey, I'm applying for a study through, we've finished enrollment and all study activities, but it is a key one in making sure that you're giving your site the best chance to be selected for those high interest indications. So it should be one that should be taken seriously, attention to detail, completeness, really trying to use this document, if you're a site, to sell yourself to that sponsor and their CRO on why you're a good fit. So really focusing on the feasibility questionnaire itself will pay dividends, which you will see in an increased number of awards or, FQ submission to receiving an award conversion ratio in and of itself. So the last item that we wanted to talk about in terms of setting yourself up for success before turning it over to Q&A is being prepared to conduct hybrid and decentralized in general trials, right? We covered in an earlier section and talked about, hey, this is something that has been rising in industry for the last 10 or so years. So the addition of models other than your traditional trial model, and something that COVID, frankly, increased significantly, that uptake, right, within industry-sponsored studies. So now that we are all kind of aware that this is something that is increasing, the number of studies that are decentralized or hybrid, what does that mean for clinical research sites, right? Or practices, health systems, hospitals that want to break into research. So it provides a great opportunity to start conducting decentralized trials early. And again, when we're talking about decentralized trials, that's really going to be a very broad definition. So for a hybrid trial, for example, that could be anything from, if there's 10 study visits, that 8 of them are on site to 8 of them are either telehealth or home health type services. But getting in early and having decentralized trials on your resume, or on your CV, I should say, will pay dividends down the road as they become more common, right? And you're applying for new ones. Another key point is that gaining experience, right, as I said, is going to position you to be more attractive as you're applying for other studies that have decentralized or hybrid trial elements. But what does that really mean for the site in and of itself, right? Because these are differentiated from a traditional trial model. So you may have to consider things such as establishing new workflows to account for the differentiated study structures, right? Coordination of home health visits, increased patient-reported outcome reminders, as well as vendor management, right? Because you'll see that involved not just at the site level, but at the patient level. So again, this is a big topic that could probably be discussed in a whole webinar in and of itself. But as we are hitting you with a number of different things, we at least wanted to have some high-level takeaways, right? Of if you're not currently conducting or have not conducted a decent number of hybrid trials, some things that you should consider moving forward. So with that being said, we will turn it back over to Xtalks for the Q&A, and we want to thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you both very much for that insightful presentation. As we move on to the Q&A session, I'd like to direct the audience's attention towards the handouts module within the GoToWebinar control panel, where you'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. I'd also like to invite the audience to keep sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. I've already received some questions, so we'll get ourselves started with those. I know you kind of finished off, Riley, by talking about some key takeaways. Right as that happens, someone's coming in, they're wondering if you could really just expand more. They want to know, what would you say are the key takeaways for sites to get set up for research, and what tips you might have for sites to move in that direction?
That's a really great question, Ryan. So key takeaways for sites that are getting set or interested, because I'm interpreting this question as, hey, we're interested in starting to conduct research. What do we need to be thinking about in order to operationalize that and move into actual conducting research? So a few of the key elements that you need to think about are staff, right? Do I have the right staff? Typically, that's going to be investigators, right? So principal investigator will typically be an MD or a DO, right? And then sub-investigator, which could also be an MD or a DO, they could be an NP, something along those lines as well. And then you have your clinical research coordinator. That is a very, very important position that wears a number of different hats, but essentially they are the train conductor that's orchestrating patients being in the right room at the right time to see, for the physicians to see them, right, for study assessments, so on and so forth. So that's from a staff standpoint. And then I would also echo the what therapeutic area are you going to break into? That's probably especially important if you work in a multi-specialty facility, whether that be a practice, health system, or hospital, of understanding, hey, am I going to target oncology first? Am I going to target neurology? Am I going to target this therapeutic area? We kind of went over the various elements that can help you decide what to break into based upon a number of different factors. And then also just thinking about it from a workload standpoint, right? Of, hey, how do I want to stack trials, right? Do I want to apply and have 5 start at once? Do I want to start my first one, start one 3 months later, another 3 months after that, so on and so forth. So how you go from, I'm not conducting research, to getting your feet wet, to start really building out your research program. Dawn, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I just, as you were talking, I was thinking about there's some of the marketing aspect of it too, and getting out there and socializing your desire to get into research. If you have MSLs that are visiting your practice, A lot of the times they can help you get set up and have some studies that maybe are med affairs for approved products that the sponsors won't see it as a bigger risk having a new researcher on. Most CROs have a join our site network type of click in, and then you'll start getting feasibility assessments where you'll probably fill some sort of survey out initially, and then be able to get some of the studies that there's 85% of clinical trials run through a CRO. So establishing yourself with the CROs is a good way to have a funnel of studies coming your way. And then just getting out there, if you're going to a conference or a meeting, just getting out there and networking with the other sponsors that are there or the CROs that are present are always looking for more sites as well.
And Ryan, just to dovetail, because something Dawn said made me think of another element. So Dawn touched on, right, leveraging potentially an MSL relationship to generate studies in and of themselves, talking about, phase 4s, things along those lines. So another key aspect, right, of if you're new to, or you're trying to break into research, is understanding that you may have to get some experience under your belt before you get a phase 2 interventional trial, right? So that could be a phase 4, like Dawn mentioned. It may be a sample collection, but basically easier to manage studies that not only have the benefit of, hey, I now have that experience on my CV that makes me more attractive for your interventional phase 2 and phase 3 studies, but also builds your staff's experience, right, and comfort level in conducting research.
Right. All right.
Good
Very
point.
interesting. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts on that topic. The next question I have here is wondering, what is the best way for my site to start conducting oncology trials if we don't currently have an oncologist who can serve as an investigator?
I think, to Riley's point that he just made, I think that's where some of the diagnostics or early cancer detection studies can come in, because a lot of the times those patients are being diagnosed at different practices. And, honestly, the oncologists aren't necessarily wanting to do too many of those studies, as their interest and experience is more in the interventional space and interventional trials. So that's a good way. Another opportunity is if you partner with an oncologist, if there's a place where, say, you're a gastroenterologist and you're referring your patients that are getting worked up or newly diagnosed with gastric cancers to an oncologist, but maybe that's in a city somewhere and you're in a suburb, you could always serve as a satellite site, partner with that oncologist and be a satellite site so that some of the assessments could get done at your clinic. And it suits the patients too. The patients aren't going to have to travel to that oncologist. So think about the referral pathways and how you could leverage your relationships with other specialists to maybe become part of their research team and then establish yourself that way.
All right, very good thoughts to consider. The next question says that their site wants to break into a new therapeutic area. They're wondering if you can expand on what factors you think they should consider when deciding which therapeutic area is best for them.
Absolutely. And again, without knowing the specifics of who asked this, what therapeutic area they're already in and what their setup is, I would point back to one of the sections that we covered where we talked about how to pick the right therapeutic area. What are your considerations? So if you want to think about it from a sheer standpoint of, hey, I want to expand into an area that's going to have a high volume of trials, for the foreseeable future, at least the next couple of years, really try to get your hands on some industry data, right? That will show, hey, the number of drugs in development in phase 1, phase 2, you can project out from there, but also just think about it, right? So what are the factors that incentivize research and development? And how are they applicable to, if you're considering multiple therapeutic areas, each one? And then obviously take a look at what Dawn and I both, I think, just touched on in our various answers of, do I have the right staff, right? Namely the investigators to conduct studies in, one of these two therapeutic areas. And lastly, are we situated, right? From a procedures, equipment, imaging capabilities, so on and so forth standpoint. And by knowing what your current setup, your current capabilities are, you'll know what do I need to do to get equipped for this new area, which will help your decision making.
Yep.
Right.
And yeah, I think looking at clinicaltrials.gov is a good resource too. To your point, Riley, look at what is in the early phases and probably is moving into later phase and how things are progressing. Also, sometimes it's as simple as looking at the pipeline of some of the big pharma and seeing what they're working on and what's in. If you're newer to research, you're more likely to be placed on a phase 3 study. So look at what they have in phase 2 and see if you can leverage that and get involved there. Even approach them at conferences. Sometimes that helps.
Mm-hmm.
Great tips. Thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion for this webinar. Now, if we can attend to your questions, the team at Elligo Health will reach out to you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on the screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm also sending you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues, who will be able to view it once they register for the event as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our wonderful speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.